For more than 500 years, the origins of the Yoruba people have been one of the most explosive, unresolved questions in West African history. Kings staked their authority on it. Priests built entire religious systems around it. Colonial officers twisted it to fit their own theories of race and civilization. Historians spent careers arguing over it and never reached the same conclusion twice. And for 5 centuries, no one, not a king, not a scholar, not a single outside observer, had any way to settle the question using anything more solid than legend, faith, or the bias of whoever happened to be holding the pen. Then, in February of 2020, inside a genetics lab at the University of California, Los Angeles, 2 researchers ran a routine statistical model on genome data from 4 West African populations and got a result that made them stop and run it again. Arun Durvasula and Sriram Sankararaman were searching for the kind of ancient genetic noise left behind when 2 different human groups interbreed tens of thousands of years apart. What their model flagged should not have been there at all. Buried inside the DNA of ordinary people living across Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Gambia was genetic material that did not match modern humans, did not match Neanderthals, and did not match Denisovans either. It matched nothing in the known human family tree. In some individuals, this unidentified genetic material made up close to 1/5 of their entire genome, sitting there silently for tens of thousands of years, undetected, unnamed, and completely unknown to the very people carrying it inside every cell of their bodies. No headlines broke that week, no alarms sounded. But quietly, a 500-year-old argument about where an entire nation of people came from had just collided head-on with a discovery so strange that scientists still cannot fully explain it today. And the population sitting closest to the center of that discovery was the Yoruba, one of the largest ethnic nations on the African continent, a people whose origin story had been fought over by kings, priests, colonial officers, and historians for half a millennium without ever being settled. To understand how a routine genome study turned into one of the strangest findings in modern human evolution, you have to go back to the beginning, to a sacred city, a disputed founder, and an argument that no living person alone could ever resolve. For more than 500 years, the question of where the Yoruba people truly came from has divided historians, colonial ethnographers, religious leaders, and royal courts. Kings traced their authority back to conflicting versions of the same founding legend. Missionaries wrote down oral traditions that contradicted each other. European anthropologists imposed their own theories onto a civilization they barely understood. And for centuries, there was no tool powerful enough to settle any of it, only tradition, faith, and the assumptions of whichever outsider happened to be holding the pen. The Yoruba are not a small or marginal group tucked away in a forgotten corner of the world. They are one of the largest ethnic nations in Africa, with tens of millions of people spread across southwestern Nigeria, Benin, and Togo today. But the true reach of Yoruba identity extends far beyond West Africa itself. Through the brutal machinery of the transatlantic slave trade, millions of Yoruba men, women, and children were forcibly transported across the Atlantic, carrying their language, their cosmology, and their gods with them into bondage. In Brazil, Yoruba spiritual practice was reshaped into candomblé. In Cuba, it became the foundation of Santeria. Across Trinidad, Haiti, and the wider Caribbean, the veneration of deities like Shango, Yemoja, and Ocean survived for centuries under new names and new disguises, carried forward by people who had been ripped from their homeland but never fully severed from it. Today, scholars estimate that well over 100 million people worldwide carry some living connection to Yoruba spiritual and cultural tradition. This is not a quiet regional history question. It is a question with genetic and cultural stakes stretching across 3 continents, touching the ancestry of people from Ibadan to Bahia, from Lagos to Havana. At the spiritual heart of this entire civilization sits one city, Ile-Ife. Yoruba oral tradition calls it nothing less than the birthplace of humanity itself, the exact point on Earth where creation began. And at the center of Ile-Ife's founding story stands a single figure, Oduduwa. But ask where Oduduwa actually came from, and you will get 3 completely different answers, and Yoruba historians have never fully agreed on which one is the truth. The first tradition is purely spiritual and forms the sacred core of Yoruba cosmology. In this account, Oduduwa was lowered from the heavens by Olodumare, the supreme creator, descending on an iron chain carrying nothing but a handful of soil, a 5-toed chicken, and a palm kernel. As he descended toward the primordial waters that covered the earth, the chicken slipped from his grasp and began spiraling downward. In a desperate attempt to catch it, Oduduwa let go of the sack of soil instead, and both objects fell together onto the water below. The chicken scattered the soil across the surface, and wherever that soil landed, dry land began to form, becoming the very ground on which Ile-Ife would be built. The palm kernel took root and grew into the first tree. its branches eventually producing 16 palm fronds, said to represent the 16 original kingdoms that would descend from Oduduwa's lineage. In this telling, the Yoruba are not migrants from anywhere at all. They are, quite literally, the people from whom the rest of humanity descended. The second tradition comes from a very different kind of source, a written record rather than a purely oral one. Samuel Johnson, a Yoruba Anglican minister, spent decades in the late 19th century compiling generations of oral testimony into the first comprehensive written history of the Yoruba people. Johnson never lived to see his manuscript published. It was released after his death in 1921, edited by his brother, and it remains, more than a century later, one of the single most influential sources on Yoruba history ever produced. Within that text, Johnson recorded a strikingly different version of Oduduwa's origin, one in which Oduduwa was not divine at all, but a real historical migrant, a man who left Mecca after a religious dispute, journeyed for 90 days, and arrived at Ile-Ife carrying idols that had made him unwelcome in his homeland. In Johnson's account, the founder of the Yoruba nation was an outsider from the Arabian Peninsula who arrived with a small group of followers and gradually established dominance over an already existing local population. The third tradition points in an entirely different direction. Instead of Arabia, some historians and early European ethnographers pointed toward ancient Egypt, or the ancient kingdom of Meroe in what is now Sudan, proposing that Oduduwa and his followers migrated westward from the Nile Valley, bringing with them the political and religious sophistication of ancient Egyptian civilization. This theory fit comfortably inside a much broader and deeply flawed intellectual framework that dominated colonial-era anthropology, sometimes called the Hamitic hypothesis, the now thoroughly discredited assumption that any sufficiently advanced African civilization must have been founded or shaped by lighter-skinned migrants from North Africa or the Near East, because indigenous sub-Saharan populations were wrongly assumed incapable of building such complexity on their own. That colonial-era bias shaped how European scholars interpreted Yoruba bronze work, urban planning, and political sophistication for decades, long before any real genetic evidence existed to test it one way or another. 3 legends, 3 points of origin: heaven, Mecca, and Egypt. For hundreds of years, no one had a reliable way to test any of them. Each version served a different political or spiritual purpose. The heavenly origin story reinforced the sacredness of Ile-Ife and the divine legitimacy of its royal lineages. The Mecca account, recorded during a period of growing Islamic influence across West Africa, gave the Yoruba monarchy a symbolic connection to the wider Islamic world. The Egyptian theory slotted neatly into the colonial-era framework, insisting that sophisticated statecraft and artistry must have originated somewhere else, rather than developing organically within West Africa itself. Archaeology began complicating all 3 stories long before genetics ever entered the picture. Excavations at Ile-Ife uncovered extraordinary bronze and terracotta sculptures, among the finest naturalistic portraiture produced anywhere in the medieval world, dating to roughly the 11th through 15th centuries, a period now referred to as Ife's classical age. The technical sophistication of these castings, produced using the lost wax method, was so advanced that early European observers reportedly struggled to believe local artisans had created them without outside instruction, an assumption modern archaeologists have since thoroughly dismantled through the discovery of local production sites, tools, and raw materials scattered across the region. Linguistic research pushed the timeline back even further, suggesting that Yoruba, as a distinct language, had likely been developing in place for well over 2,000 years, emerging gradually from earlier populations already settled in the forest zone of what is now southwestern Nigeria, with the city-state at Ile-Ife itself possibly taking shape as early as the 5th century BCE. Instead of confirming a single foreign founder arriving to civilize an empty land, the evidence increasingly pointed towards something far more complicated, a civilization that developed largely in place over an extraordinarily long period of time, absorbing outside influences without ever being founded by them. But oral tradition, archaeology, and linguistics could only take the debate so far. None of them could answer the most basic biological question underneath all of it. Where did the ancestors of the Yoruba people actually come from, genetically speaking? Were they, as the Mecca and Egypt tradition suggested, descendants of relatively recent arrivals from North Africa or the Middle East, layered on top of an existing local population? Or did their ancestry run deep and local, tracing back thousands of years within West Africa itself, with no significant outside admixture at all? For that question, only DNA could offer a real answer. And DNA, unlike legend, does not care about politics. That infrastructure did not exist for most of the 20th century, not for lack of curiosity, but because African populations were dramatically underrepresented in early genetic databases, even though Africa holds more human genetic diversity than every other continent on Earth combined. It took deliberate, targeted effort to correct that imbalance and bring West African populations into the same genomic detail already available for populations in London, Tokyo, or Utah. When the International HapMap Project and later the 1000 Genomes Project set out to build the world's first comprehensive map of human genetic variation, researchers needed reference populations from every major region of the globe. From West Africa, they selected a single group to represent the region's staggering genetic diversity, the Yoruba people of Ibadan, Nigeria. That population is now known throughout genetics literature by a simple code, YRI, and it has since become one of the most extensively studied population groups in the entire field of human genomics. The 1000 Genomes Project eventually sequenced over 2,500 individuals across 26 populations on 5 continents, cataloging more than 84 million genetic variants, and the Yoruba sample from Ibadan became one of the most heavily cited African datasets in the entire project. Every time a geneticist anywhere in the world needed a West African reference point to compare against European, East Asian, or South Asian populations, there was a strong chance they were reaching for Yoruba data. That single decision meant that when the deeper question of Yoruba origins finally got asked using real genomic tools instead of oral tradition or colonial guesswork, the raw data to answer it was already sitting in laboratories from Cambridge to California, waiting for a question 500 years older than the technology itself. The first major clue came from mitochondrial DNA, genetic material passed down exclusively through the maternal line, generation after generation, changing only through the slow accumulation of mutations over thousands of years. In a detailed forensic genetic study analyzing the mitochondrial control region of 71 Yoruba individuals, researchers identified 65 unique mitochondrial haplotypes, producing a haplotype diversity score of 0. 9976, a number so close to the theoretical maximum that it places Yoruba maternal lineages among the most diverse of any population ever studied anywhere on Earth. This is consistent with one of the foundational facts of human genetics. Because modern humans evolved in Africa, populations there have simply had far longer to accumulate genetic diversity than populations anywhere else on the planet. West Africa, in particular, carries some of the deepest, richest genetic variation known to science, often holding more diversity within a single region of Nigeria than exists across entire continents outside Africa. But diversity alone could not answer the origin question. What mattered far more was how that diversity compared to neighboring populations. To measure this, geneticists use a statistic called FST, which essentially scores how much genetic separation exists between two groups. A value near 0 means two populations are genetically almost indistinguishable from one another, while a high value suggests a long history of separation or limited interbreeding. When researchers calculated the FST between the Yoruba sample and a broader Nigerian dataset from the 1000 Genomes Project, the result came back effectively at 0, a statistically insignificant difference. When they compared Yoruba maternal lineages to a geographically close population in Ghana, the genetic distance was also extremely small and not statistically meaningful. In plain terms, on the maternal line, Yoruba ancestry blends almost seamlessly into the genetic landscape of the surrounding West African region. There is no sign of a distinct, separate maternal lineage suddenly appearing from Arabia or the Nile Valley. Genetically speaking, the mothers of the Yoruba nation look like the mothers of West Africa as a whole. The second piece of evidence came from a study comparing 5 major Nigerian ethnic groups, Yoruba, Igbo, Hausa, Tiv, and Efik, using 9 short tandem repeat DNA markers, the same kind of markers used today in forensic identification and paternity testing. Researchers extracted DNA from blood samples of 250 consenting participants, sampled directly from their ethnic homelands across Nigeria, and compared allele patterns across all 9 genetic locations. The pairwise genetic similarity between Yoruba and Igbo populations came out to 0, 9993, the highest of any pairing recorded in the entire study. Yoruba and Efik scored 0. 990. Yoruba and Hausa came in at 0, 992. Yoruba and Tiv registered 0, 987. By contrast, the Igbo and Efik populations, despite being close geographic neighbors, showed the lowest similarity in the entire study, at just 0. 895, a striking reminder that geographic closeness does not always predict genetic closeness the way people assume it should. And when researchers ran a full analysis of molecular variants across all 5 groups, the results were even more striking. 99, 98% of all genetic variation existed between individuals, regardless of ethnicity, while only 10% of variation could be attributed to differences between entire ethnic populations. Put another way, if you lined up 2 random Yoruba people and compared their DNA, there is a strong chance they would show more genetic difference from each other than the average Yoruba person shows compared to the average Hausa, Igbo, or Tiv person. Ethnic identity in Nigeria, the data showed, is a powerful cultural, linguistic, and historical category, built on language, tradition, religion, and political history. But at the level of the raw genome, these populations are far more genetically similar to one another than they are distinct. That finding did more than simply describe modern Nigeria. It quietly undercut the entire premise behind both the Mecca and Egypt origin theories, both of which required Yoruba ancestry to be meaningfully distinct from surrounding West African populations because of a relatively recent, geographically distant founding migration. The genome showed the exact opposite. Deep, long-standing continuity with neighboring peoples, not a layer of foreign ancestry sitting on top of a separate substrate. The third study went further still and added a twist that historians had not expected. Researchers examining both maternal mitochondrial DNA and paternal Y-chromosome markers across Hausa, Yoruba, and Igbo populations, a combined sample of 358 individuals, found that while all three groups shared a broadly similar maternal genetic substrate, consistent with a cultural pattern known as patrilocality, in which women historically married into their husband's community while men remained rooted near their birthplace, the paternal picture told a strikingly different story. Yoruba and Igbo, both speakers of Niger-Congo languages, showed paternal lineages correlated with other populations who shared that same language family, regardless of geographic distance. Hausa, by contrast, whose language belongs to the entirely unrelated Afroasiatic family, showed paternal lineages more closely aligned with other Afroasiatic-speaking populations scattered across Africa, including groups far beyond Nigeria's borders, and displayed a notably higher diversity of paternal lineages drawn from across the continent. In other words, on the paternal line, ancient language and ancient ancestry appear to move together across West Africa in a way that cuts directly across simple geography. This finding did not hand a victory to either the Mecca theory or the Egypt theory. Arabic and ancient Egyptian both belong to the Afroasiatic language family, and if Yoruba paternal ancestry carried significant roots there, it would likely show some measurable pull toward that same Afroasiatic cluster, the way Hausa ancestry does. It does not. Yoruba paternal lineages sit firmly within the Niger-Congo genetic and linguistic cluster, reinforcing the exact same conclusion the maternal data had already pointed toward. Local, deep-rooted West African ancestry, not a recent arrival from Arabia or the Nile. By this point, the genetic evidence had accomplished what 500 years of oral tradition, colonial theorizing, and archaeological debate never managed. It did not simply favor one legend over the other two. It moved past all three, replacing migration stories and singular founder figures with a picture of long, continuous in-place development stretching back thousands of years, deeply interconnected with the broader web of West African peoples. That should have been the end of the story. It was not. That 2020 UCLA study was not, at its outset, about Ile-Ife, Oduduwa, or the last 2,000 years of Yoruba history at all. It was investigating something rooted tens of thousands of years deeper in the human story. Most people outside genetics do not realize that people with European, Asian, or Oceanian ancestry today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal or Denisovan DNA, genetic leftovers from ancient interbreeding, as modern humans migrated out of Africa and encountered these archaic relatives. The working assumption had long been that West African populations, whose ancestors never left the continent, carried none of this kind of archaic ancestry, since Neanderthals and Denisovans are known primarily from Europe and Asia. Using advanced statistical modeling on genomic data from 4 West African populations, Yoruba, Esan, Mende, and Gambian, drawn from more than 400 individuals in the 1,000 Genomes dataset, Durvasula and Sankararaman set out to test that assumption directly. What they detected was something no oral tradition, no archaeological dig, and no historical document could ever have predicted. Buried within the genomes of Yoruba and Mende individuals in particular, they found segments of DNA, between 2 and 19% of the genome depending on the individual, that did not match modern human ancestry at all, and did not match Neanderthal or Denisovan ancestry either. This genetic material appeared to originate from what researchers call a ghost population, an unidentified, extinct branch of the human family tree that split off from the ancestors of modern humans before the evolutionary divergence that eventually produced Neanderthals and Denisovans. No fossil of this population has ever been found. No name exists for it anywhere in scientific literature. Only its genetic echo, detected purely through mathematical analysis of modern DNA. The statistical modeling behind the discovery went further than a simple percentage. By comparing the age of these unusual DNA segments to ordinary segments within the same genomes, the researchers found that the archaic material was, on average, about 1.7 times older than typical non-archaic DNA, evidence consistent with a genuinely ancient introgression event, rather than statistical noise. Their broader modeling estimated that this mysterious lineage split from the ancestors of modern humans somewhere between 300 and 60,000 and just over 1 million years ago, with the actual interbreeding event itself occurring anywhere from the present day back to roughly 124,000 years in the past, and involving a source population with an estimated effective size in the tens of thousands. At some point, deep within the African continent, the ancestors of today's Yoruba, Asan, Mende, and Gambian peoples interbred with a now extinct human relative that science cannot yet identify, in an event that left no skeletal trace anywhere except inside the genome itself. Some of this inherited DNA appears far from random. Certain segments were retained at higher than expected frequencies, clustering near genes involved in tumor suppression and hormone regulation, a pattern suggesting these ancient contributions may have carried a survival advantage, spreading not by chance, but because they helped. The same analysis noted faint traces of this same mysterious ancestry showing up even in Han Chinese and European populations, though far less prominently than in the Yoruba and Mende samples, hinting that whatever this archaic population once was, its genetic legacy may have rippled outward across a far wider swath of humanity than researchers initially expected. It is worth being precise about what this discovery does and does not claim. The ghost population identified by Durvasula and Sankararaman is a statistical inference, not a confirmed species, with a fossil skeleton sitting in a museum drawer somewhere. In the years since the original publication, other research teams have revisited the question, debating the exact percentage figures, the precise timing of the interbreeding, and whether a single ghost population or several smaller distinct introgression events best explain the pattern buried inside the data. That kind of scientific back and forth is normal, and it is still ongoing today. But the core finding, that West African genomes, including Yoruba genomes, carry measurable ancestry from an archaic human lineage entirely outside the known Neanderthal and Denisovan family tree, has held up across multiple independent analyses since the original 2020 publication, and it has pushed other research teams to search for similar signals in populations across the rest of the continent, from Central African rainforest groups to populations in southern and eastern Africa whose genomes have barely been studied at all. Suddenly, the mystery of Yoruba origins was no longer just about Ile-Ife or a founding migration somewhere in the historical era. It stretched back into an entirely separate, far older chapter of human evolution, involving a species science has no name for, an event that cannot be precisely dated, and a genetic inheritance that every oral tradition, every colonial ethnographer, and every historian arguing over Mecca versus Egypt versus heaven had no way of ever knowing existed. For 500 years, the question of where the Yoruba people came from was fought over using legends, religious texts, and colonial-era theory, each version shaped as much by the politics of its era as by any real evidence. Genetics did not just settle that argument. It revealed that the true story was simultaneously simpler and far stranger than anyone had ever proposed. A population rooted deeply and continuously in West Africa for thousands of years, sharing ancestry with its neighbors far more than any founding legend allowed for, and carrying hidden inside its genome a trace of a human relative that no one has ever seen, named, or found. Think about what that means for the more than 100 million people around the world today who carry some connection to Yoruba heritage. From Ibadan to Bahia, from Lagos to Havana, their ancestors built one of West Africa's great civilizations, survived a forced diaspora that scattered their language and religion across 3 continents, and, without ever knowing it, carried forward a genetic inheritance from a human species that vanished from the fossil record entirely, leaving behind nothing but a signal buried inside living DNA. The history written in Yoruba DNA did not come from Mecca. It did not come from Egypt. In one sense, it did not even come from what we would recognize as fully modern humans alone. It came from West Africa itself, layered and relayered over tens of thousands of years, holding memories that no oral tradition was ever built to carry. And that raises a question worth sitting with. If a 500-year-old mystery about a single people's origin was hiding a genetic secret this old, this strange, and this well-preserved, what else is still waiting inside the rest of the human genome, in populations that scientists have not yet studied this closely at all?